Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week we talk history with a pair of storytellers whose unique perspectives bring past events to life. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Ken Randell, who's personally assembled the world's most unique and comprehensive collection of documents and artifacts from World War II. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Rob McDonald, professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and author of Confounding Father, Thomas Jefferson's Image in His Own Time. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. And I'm supposed to say something up front. My views don't necessarily represent those of the United States Military Academy, the Army, or the Department of Defense.
Oh, I thought you spoke for the whole country.
Absolutely.
Well, Rob, I finished your book last night. I read a lot about Thomas Jefferson, but your book was the first one that made me feel like I was right there in the middle of all the contemporary controversies. Revisionist historians spend most of their time trashing Jefferson's acquiescence of slavery and his affair with Sally Hemings, but his political enemies are more concerned with the deep divisions between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Take us back to George Washington's first term and his futile wish that America might never be plagued by political parties. How did all the trouble begin?
Well, I suppose it began when the Constitution was ratified. Madison is the father of the Constitution. One of his partners in that project of ratification, one of his key allies, is Alexander Hamilton. They thought that they agreed on what the Constitution meant when they were arguing in behalf of it, but when it came time to put this government into practice, it became pretty clear that there were some deep disagreements.
How did Hamilton's overall vision for America clash with Jefferson's?
Hamilton once wrote a memo to George Washington where he was discussing foreign policy, and he referred kind of metaphorically to British Canada on our left and Latin America on our right. And that's interesting because it shows that Hamilton's orientation is toward the East. He's looking toward Europe. He's looking especially toward Great Britain, which I think he sees as a model for America's future. On one hand, that seemed crazy, right? I mean, we had just fought a war for independence from Great Britain. But on the other hand, Britain is the most powerful nation on the planet. It's the richest nation on the planet at the time. And at the time, it was the second most free nation on the planet. So it's not a preposterous role model for the United States. And Hamilton, I think, really saw us as this future colossus that would be able to project power across the ocean, that would be engaged with the rest of the world as this great commercial republic. And so he viewed the role of the federal government as helping to make that happen.
And how did Jefferson see it?
Jefferson, his orientation is in the opposite direction. He sees our future in the West. And for Thomas Jefferson, the West is this fantastic place where Americans can spread out and spread what made us distinct and distinctive. We are a nation with lots of land, with lots of opportunity. We're a nation primarily of farmers. Jefferson once wrote that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God because they're virtuous, they're self-reliant, they're independent. They support themselves, which makes them independent not only of means, but of mind, right? There's no one who has an American under his thumb. That's the ideal. And if we could retain our spirit as this independent people who are good citizens and good neighbors, that will allow what was really, I think, a precarious experiment with self-government the best chance at succeeding.
Where did John Adams stand in this philosophical divide?
Yeah, I suppose, if you wanted to situate Jefferson and Hamilton at opposite poles of all this, Adams would be between the two. Adams is a Federalist like Hamilton, but he's a moderate Federalist. And he personally has some grave misgivings about Hamilton and vice versa. And their relationship is going to deteriorate as the 1790s wear on.
The presidential election of 1796 turned into a struggle between these competing visions of America's future. Give us a brief outline of that campaign and its outcome.
It's interesting. You earlier referred to Jefferson and Madison and their party as the Anti-Federalists. You kind of fell into a trap that Alexander Hamilton laid for you. He wanted people to think that Jefferson and Madison were opposed to the Constitution, which is really absurd. I mean, Madison is, as I said, the father of the Constitution. And Jefferson and Madison thought that they were the adherents to the Constitution, that Hamilton is the one who had strayed from the intent of the Constitution. They called themselves Republicans, though, and that implied that Hamilton and Adams and the Federalist Party, if you're not a Republican in the 1790s, what must you be? A monarchist.
Right.
So, in a way, the election of 1796 is almost like a contest between two competing revolutions. Jefferson and Madison see themselves as heirs of the spirit of 76, of the American Revolution, and they view Adams and Hamilton and the Federalists as counter-revolutionaries, as people who want to turn back the progress that's been made since independence. They saw the Federalists as people who wanted to establish in America this almost like crypto-monarchical, aristocratic, British-style government. Meanwhile, the Federalists, they saw the Republicans as adherents to a totally different revolution, one that people were very concerned about, the French Revolution. Jefferson had been our ambassador to France. He was there for the hopeful and opening scenes of the French Revolution. Like many Americans, he was excited that France, the world's second greatest superpower, seemed to be embracing liberty and fraternity and equality. But as the French Revolution spun out of control, to associate Thomas Jefferson with the French Revolution, with the extremism, with the anarchy, with the bloodletting, was a really powerful political tool for the Federalists, who accused Jefferson of being a radical and really fundamentally un-American. The Republicans responded to that charge by pointing out what most people at that point didn't yet know, which is that Thomas Jefferson was the person who drafted the Declaration.
So John Adams goes on to win the election and scares the hell out of everybody by passing the Sedition Act. Remind us what that was and how Jefferson and his political allies reacted.
So the Sedition Act is passed in the context of a quasi-war with France. And, hardline Federalists wanted John Adams to declare war. Politically, that would have been very advantageous for John Adams since, of course, Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans were associated with France and the French Revolution. But Adams thought that too many lives, too many fortunes could be lost. Even American independence could be lost if we took on France. Even if we defeated France, we would probably do so by allying ourselves with Great Britain. And he didn't want to risk that we would be sucked into the British orbit. So in a way to throw a bone to the Federalist dog, he comes up with the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are sort of pitched as war readiness measures. The Sedition Act said that essentially you couldn't criticize the actions of the government or the officers of the national government. And if you did, you would face possible jail time. And a couple dozen journalists, in fact, did go to jail because of criticisms that they had printed of Adams or the administration in their newspapers.
What did the Supreme Court have to say about the conflict between that and the First Amendment?
Well, remember, Marbury versus Madison had not yet been a Supreme Court case, and who interprets what the Constitution means and what is actually constitutional is still up in the air. Jefferson and James Madison thought that since the states were the parties that entered into the Constitutional Compact, it was the states that got to decide whether or not an act was in fact constitutional. That's one of the chief reasons that they sort of silently drafted for the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky a set of resolutions that criticized the Sedition Act. I mean, essentially, they pointed out that the ink had only dried on the Bill of Rights 7 years earlier, in 1791 when they were ratified. The First Amendment, there's not much ambiguity there. I mean, what was it about Congress shall pass no law that the Federalists didn't understand?
So into this complex stew of controversies comes the presidential election of 1800. Walk us through that.
In many respects, I think you could look at the election of 1800 almost as another American Revolution. I mean, Jefferson described it as such. He described it as the Revolution of 1800. And like the American Revolution, it was a long time coming. For Jeffersonian Republicans, there had been this mounting fear throughout the 1790s that the Federalists really were trying to rob them of their liberty, that they really were trying to turn America into a nation that abandoned the principles of the American Revolution. The Sedition Act of the Adams administration really kind of cemented that narrative in the heads of a lot of Americans. And so I think they saw this as the most important election ever. Certainly it was the most ill-tempered and high-pitched election ever. Jefferson was criticized in all sorts of different ways. He was criticized on the issues. He was criticized as an individual Jefferson had written a few things in support of religious toleration, and those were twisted into having Jefferson criticize religion itself. So a lot of people on the Republican side thought that the future of America hung in the balance. And what made it so mean is that the Federalists thought the same thing, that Jefferson would impose upon America the sort of atheistic anarchy that had taken over in France.
So this bitter, hard-fought election comes down to a tie and gets thrown into the House of Representatives, and then Alexander Hamilton surprises everyone. What did he do?
Yeah, right. So the tie is interesting. The Electoral College, of course, did not yet have the added feature that is the 12th Amendment, which provides that electors will cast their ballots for a presidential ticket that clearly specifies who will be the president and who will be the vice president. The Federalists, by this point, many of them at least, felt very alienated from John Adams. And Alexander Hamilton actually had hatched a plan to elect the vice presidential candidate on the Federalist side, a South Carolinian named Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, president, by having some Federalist electors throw away their Adams votes, and that way Pinckney would get more. Of course, that would only work if the Federalists won. As it turned out, they lost. And the Jeffersonians in the Electoral College were so disciplined about voting for both Jefferson and his running mate, New Yorker Aaron Burr, that they received an equal number of electoral votes. And as a result, the tie would be decided by the House of Representatives that had been elected in 1798. So the new House had not yet been seated. And it was the Federalist House of Representatives that had been elected at the height of the quasi-war with France. So this is really a decision that's going to be made by a bunch of outgoing Federalists who oppose the Republicans.
So the rival party gets to choose the president from amongst the two candidates of the other side.
Absolutely. And you can imagine how many Federalists were thinking. I mean, they had spent the better part of the past decade criticizing and hearing criticisms of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was described as a radical. He was described as an atheist. He was described as a person who really did not have the best interests of the United States at heart. And I think many Federalists thought that anyone would be better than Thomas Jefferson.
So this was the Never Jefferson Party at that point.
It was. I mean, it was certainly the Never Jefferson Party.
So what could be worse than Jefferson?
Well, Hamilton thought he knew. He was pretty sure that Aaron Burr would be a whole lot worse. You know, in a way, he flipped the Federalist argument around. A lot of Federalists believed that Burr was someone who was a bit more malleable, a person who would work well with Federalists if he owed them the presidency. But what Hamilton convinced Federalists, especially the one Federalist congressman from Delaware, and remember that in the case of an electoral tie, the members of Congress vote as state delegations. Mm-hmm. And Delaware had a delegation of one, right? Just one congressman. So James Baird of Delaware had an oversized influence on this decision. And Hamilton wrote to him and he said, listen, if you elect Jefferson, we will be electing a man who has principles with which we disagree. If you elect Aaron Burr, we'll be electing a man with no principles whatsoever.
I think we've been hearing echoes of that argument lately.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so.
So how did it all come out?
Well, Baird was one of the people who flipped his vote. And finally, in February of 1801, the House of Representatives gave the election to Thomas Jefferson.
So before we dig into Thomas Jefferson's presidency, just for the lighter moment, tell us the story about the Mammoth Cheese.
Yeah, well, when Jefferson became president, I think there were a lot of Americans who sort of felt like they had arrived. Their candidate became the president. Jefferson and his principles were going to be the saviors of the American Revolution and the spirit of 76. And the statements that Jefferson had made about religious toleration, the ones that were used against him by the Federalists, actually inspired a lot of Americans, including members of religious minorities. So the Mammoth Cheese was a gift presented to Jefferson by a preacher from Cheshire, Massachusetts, a dairying community named Elder John Leland. And he led a group of Baptists who chafed at the Congregationalist church establishment of the state of Massachusetts. They really admired Jefferson for his views on religious freedom. They made this 2,000-pound Mammoth Cheese, and they inscribed it with Jefferson's personal motto, which was, "Rebellion against tyrants is obedience to God." And they put it on a sled, and they towed the thing to the Hudson River, where they put it on a barge and took it down to New York City, where they put it on a sloop and sailed it to Baltimore. And then in Baltimore, it was placed on top of a specially built wagon festooned with red, white, and blue bunting, and it was presented to Thomas Jefferson on New Year's Day, 1802.
Now, Thomas Jefferson's personal style, his manner of dress, how he comported and transported himself, was very different than George Washington or even John Adams. What was that all about?
Well, I think Jefferson thought that instead of aping the monarchical gestures and etiquette of European court society, what we should really do is aim for small r Republican simplicity. So, for example, at Jefferson's inauguration, he didn't ride in a special liveried coach. He walked to his inauguration behind a small parade of local dignitaries. When Jefferson had dinners at the presidential house, rather than having tables with assigned seating and a high end and a low end, he had circular tables where people would just seat themselves. In the Washington administration and the Adams administration, you would greet the president by this courtly bow. Jefferson replaced that with the handshake. So I think he was trying to come up with a more American and more Republican style for our official ceremonies.
That's all gone now, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so.
For those just joining us, we're speaking with West Point professor Rob McDonald, author of Confounding Father, Thomas Jefferson's Image in His Own Time. So Jefferson was pledged to a minimalist view of federal power. I mean, maybe he was the first and only libertarian president, and yet he engineered the Louisiana Purchase, which was a power grab completely unanticipated by the Constitution. And that worked out great for America in the long run, but how did it play at the time?
I think it's unfair to say that Thomas Jefferson abandoned his principles. In a case like Louisiana, Jefferson had to choose between competing principles. There had been a long-standing problem with the American West in that the Spanish, who had controlled the other side of the Mississippi River, as well as the city of New Orleans, wouldn't allow Americans to navigate on the river and enter into the Gulf of Mexico and trade with the rest of the world. France had a treaty with Spain that was going to cause Louisiana to be transferred to France. So Jefferson sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to France to negotiate a treaty for the purchase of New Orleans. Napoleon, by that point, was pretty desperate for cash. In addition, France had lost Haiti in the Haitian Revolution. Napoleon had sort of seen Louisiana as the breadbasket for Haiti. The land in Haiti was so valuable for growing sugar, you wouldn't want to devote even an acre to cultivating wheat or corn. But once Haiti is lost, Napoleon kind of loses interest in Louisiana, and he's much more interested in selling it to the United States, and he offers it up. And of course, Monroe and Livingston are eager to accept that deal. So Jefferson received news of this proposed treaty with France to purchase Louisiana on July 4th, 1803. And I mean, what an amazing deal. For $15 million without firing a shot, for 3 cents an acre, we would be able to double the size of the United States. And Jefferson thought this was fantastic. It was fantastic because we would have land to farm, as he wrote, for hundreds of generations. It was fantastic because just as the Atlantic Ocean insulated us from the problems of Europe, if we could control that land to the west of the Mississippi, that would insulate us from the problems of Europe. If we didn't possess it, if the Spanish didn't possess it, the French would possess it. The British, of course, are north of us in Canada. The British and the French were perpetually at war, it seemed. We'd be sucked into their problems. So Louisiana would keep us at peace. But the problem, of course, is, as you pointed out, the Constitution doesn't have any specific provision for adding territory to the United States. And, you know, there was probably a reason for that. In many respects, you could think of the United States as a union between North and South. To add the West would make it this weird sort of menage a trois. And you would have people wondering, is the West going to be more like the North?
Right.
Is the West going to be more like the South? Are the future residents of Kansas going to be cod fishermen like the people of Massachusetts? Or are they going to be farmers and slaveholders like the people of Virginia?
Well, which, of course, did lead to troubles later.
It does. And the high point of Jefferson's presidency would be Louisiana. But it certainly does come with problems because every time we add a new state, the question is going to, be brought up. Will this be a slave state or will this be a state that bans slavery? And what will the future character of America as a result be?
Well, that was left to a future generation. Thomas Jefferson was reelected president by a landslide in 1804, but the love affair didn't last. Describe the Embargo Act that might have been the low point of his presidency and why it embittered him to large sections of the country.
The embargo was a response to the fact that both British ships and French ships were attacking our ships and seizing our cargoes on the high seas. Again, Britain and France are at war. We are a neutral nation. We are happy to trade with Britain and its allies. We are happy to trade with France and its allies. Britain isn't very happy, though, that we're trading with France, and France isn't very happy that we're trading with Britain. So as our ships are being attacked, people are, looking at Thomas Jefferson and saying, as people oftentimes say to the government, you need to do something. But what is Jefferson to do? War is one option, but just as John Adams considered the possibility of war, so did Jefferson. There was a whole lot to be lost if we wagered that we could take on one of these European superpowers. The embargo, however, Jefferson conceived of as an experiment in what he called commercial coercion. Europe would need America as long as Europe needed to eat. And if we embargoed Britain and France and, of course, the rest of the world, because if we sold wheat to some third party, they would merely be a middleman and trade it with these Europeans. The French and the British, ultimately, Jefferson thought, would recognize our neutral trading rights and peaceable commerce would be restored.
How did that go over in places like Boston?
It didn't go over well at all. I mean, Boston, Salem, was one time a bustling seaport. And after the embargo, there are soup kitchens, there are bread lines. And it doesn't really go over well in the South either. I mean, there are a lot of plantations that grow crops for export. People didn't have any place to dispose of their goods, a lot of which are perishable. So America was hard hit as a result of the embargo. But Jefferson thought that it was a sacrifice preferable to the sacrifices that would come with war.
So Jefferson retired after 2 terms, keeping George Washington's tradition, largely stayed out of politics, and famously died on July 4th on the 50th anniversary of his Declaration of Independence. What was his lasting legacy?
There is so much. Although, Jefferson himself, he boiled it down to 3 things. He wrote plans for his tombstone and his epitaph, and he wrote that he wanted to be remembered for these 3 things and not a thing more. If you go to Monticello, if you look at his tombstone, you could read it for yourself. It says, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." And when you think about it, these were the 3 ways that Jefferson helped to liberate Americans in terms of body and spirit and mind. If you think about it, too, Jefferson could have included all sorts of different offices. He was a member of the House of Burgesses. He was governor. He was a member of Congress under the Articles of Confederation. He was our ambassador to France. He was our first Secretary of State, our second vice president, our third president. And yet it seems that Jefferson was trying to tell us that his glory came not from the power that men gave to him, but instead from the power that he gave to men.
Well, Rob, let's hope some of that spirit comes back to us in these troubled times. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and thanks for writing such a great book.
I appreciate it, Bill. Thank you.
That was Rob McDonald, professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and author of Confounding Father, Thomas Jefferson's Image at His Own Time, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, the donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. Ahead, Ken Rendell, founder and director of the Museum of World War II, shares the story of his lifelong quest to make sure we never forget the lessons of history. Stay tuned.